Welcome back to another bonus episode of Ice Cold Case. I am very excited about this guest who not only is a brilliant storyteller, but also someone I admire and am lucky enough to call my friend. True crime is weird, as a genre, as a culture, as a form of storytelling. But Celisia Stanton has used her unique voice and perspective to shift how true crime stories are told. In her podcast, Truer Crime, she highlights a wide range of cases from notorious headlines to cases that don't have a lot of media coverage. She gives insight to what inspires one to make a true crime podcast and her journey to season 2. And now, here's my conversation about Truer Crime with Celisia Stanton. Yeah, well, thanks for doing this. I'm really excited to talk with you just about, I kind of want to talk about your story a little bit and then sort of the evolution of your show and sort of where we are now and your thoughts on the context of the world and your show and all of the things. So let's just start from the beginning. Like, who are you? Where are you from? All of those things.
Yeah. So I'm Celisia Stanton. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have a lot of Twin Cities pride. And I host the podcast, and I'm also the creator of the podcast Truer Crime. I also was a host on the podcast The Vanishing Point, both out of Tenderfoot TV. And Truer Crime just released its second season this past Monday with 2 episodes diving into sort of the untold story of the Martin Luther King assassination, as well as the Lauren McCluskey case, which is a young woman who was sadly killed by an ex-boyfriend after repeated contacts to police who did nothing to help her. So it's an episodic true crime show. Every episode is a new case and really runs the gamut from, wrongful convictions to more like historical cases to your typical sort of true crime story.
I love it. And so you have a personal story within true crime that's you were a victim of a case. So can you tell me a little bit about sort of what prompted this, I guess, epiphany of the mix of like real life with these stories?
Yeah. So for me, I was a wedding, and I still am. I have a wedding and portrait photography business that I've run for several years, and basically since I got out of college. And so that's what I was doing. I wasn't at all in the media world or podcasting world. And I, in 2020, obviously not a lot of events going on. So there wasn't, a lot of my weddings got moved. I had a lot more free time in my hands. And then being from Minneapolis after George Floyd was killed, this is like obviously a really catalyzing event for the world, but especially in my community. And that was something that was kind of involved with in terms of like the activism and the uprising that was happening locally. And so I started posting on Instagram, just kind of racial and social justice content that education stuff that kind of resonated with people. I had a few of those posts go viral and kind of was able to grow a following on Instagram. And so that was the first time that I was like, okay, I feel like people are interested in my perspective, my lived experience as a Black woman living in the Midwest, having gay parents. I have this debate background. I did debate in high school. I coached debate for 15 years. So I love to think about things critically and engage, get into the nuances of stuff. So that all informs my perspective. And that was the first time I felt like, okay, wow, like maybe there is an audience of folks who would be interested in hearing, what I have to share. But I didn't ever love social media. It's a very obviously black and white medium, and does not have much nuance. So I felt like something longer form would be probably a better fit for me. But at that point in the early summer of 2020, I wasn't sure exactly what that was going to look like. Simultaneously, I was working with this financial advisor who was really just kind of, I really wanted someone to help me like plan for a retirement and saving for big goals, like buying a house down the line and all that stuff. Being a self-employed person, I didn't know what to do. I was like, please, somebody come in and tell me what to do. And so I had met this guy who was really great. He was really kind of well known in the local community. This was a Black man, which kind of was interesting to me because you don't see a lot of Black folks in the financial sector. So I felt like that was resonant. And then it was great because when we talked, he was like, part of my mission really and in my work is giving people who traditionally are excluded from the financial system, giving them access to that system, whether that be Black folks, women, small business owners. So I really resonated with that. And I was really excited to get to work together. So, and he was like a very hands-on kind of person. Like we would meet, like I think bi-weekly we were meeting. And he was really helping me kind of make all these investments of my savings. And then, just kind of also planning for like the general life stuff about, how should I be thinking about money and finances? So it was great until I found out a few months later that he was actually defrauding all of his investor clients. So he stole over $2 million from all of his clients, and he was using it for things like going on cruises and buying fancy cars and just really crazy. And this was a guy who was like, supposedly a family man. He had multiple kids, young kids, and he was married. He just seemed like this sort of like all-American guy. So, and he was a financial planner. Like it was true. It wasn't something that he was like pretending. He had the right educational background. He was a fiduciary, meaning that he had like extra financial obligations to like do what's best for his clients, and legal obligations, which of course were all violated. So I got a text in late 2020 where he was basically like, "Hi, I've turned myself into the FBI, and you can defer to my email if you have any questions." And that was crazy. So the FBI had been investigating him for a series of months. And I had only worked with him from like August of 2020 through till when this all kind of like unraveled in December of 2020. So he was actually under investigation either all of that time or a good amount of it. So it's kind of sad to know that like they knew, but I didn't know. And therefore I was still investing money with him. So he had stolen all of the life savings I had had to that point, which was tens of thousands of dollars. And, I'm lucky, I think, as a young person, just the amount of money that I had invested with him and just also where I'm at in my life and where hopefully my career is going, this is like was a really devastating barrier. But for some of the people that he targeted, he stole their entire retirement, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So in the aftermath of this, I was pretty depressed, obviously. And I was just literally every day I was getting up, I was doing cat puzzles and listening to true crime podcasts. I was like, this is how we're getting through this. And so I was constantly pausing the shows and complaining to my husband about like things that I just felt like were missing from the narrative. I felt like these stories were very rarely talking about race or gender or sexuality or, what are the root causes of crime? How do we actually prevent it? All these deeper critical questions. And those were questions I had. I was like, please, like, why won't somebody talk about this? And so basically I complained to him enough that he was like, why don't you start your own podcast? And I was like, oh, that's a good idea. I should do that. So that's how True Crime came to be. But, in a lot of ways, like to say like this event being the victim of this financial crime was of course a catalyzing event, but it wasn't really the full cause, right? It was more like the straw that broke the camel's back than it was, immediately causal. So it's like everything I was telling you before about this work that I was doing on Instagram and, my personal background and lived experience, that was all really informing the type of perspective that I wanted to hear in the true crime genre.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so interesting and important to know sort of the why behind these shows, because stories like yours and shows like yours fill such a gap in the genre and in the industry in general. And they can get a lot of backing sort of in the beginning as like, look, this is so interesting and different and unique, but then not sort of knowing the back context, it can feel like you get a lot of support for like a moment and then people sort of turn their attention to something else. But when you really understand like, this wasn't just a moment in time that you had where you were sitting down going, I should start a podcast. This was a life of like lived experience where like there was something missing that wasn't being told, I think is so important, and really informs, how your show is and how it was created and what it sounds like and the stories that you tell, which I think is so great. You do a good job of balancing the types of stories that you tell. So I would love to know more insight into sort of how you choose these stories, and are these stories that people send to you? Are these stories that you have a curiosity about, and like how you kind of choose your slate of cases for your seasons?
Yeah, I think in terms of how I get them, it's a mix, right? Sometimes people are suggesting them to me, or sometimes I will have heard about it myself, or sometimes I'll be like, I want to talk about a specific issue or theme, and I'm kind of looking for a case that represents that. So all different types of ways. But in terms of like what types of stories are a good fit for the show, to me, it was always really important that this be seen as a true crime podcast, not as a social justice podcast or a history podcast, or that true crime podcast that's hosted by a Black woman, like a true crime podcast. I wanted to be firmly in the genre, and I feel like to be firmly in the genre of episodic true crime, we have to cover all different types of stories. And so, but kind of bringing my perspective into it, there was a couple things that I wanted to do that I thought were a little bit more unique, which is one, trying to cover sometimes cases that are maybe considered historical, or normally you would just see them in a history context. So think the MLK episode that was just that we just released on Monday, or a season 1 we released an episode on the Tulsa Race Massacre. And these are stories that, like, typically it's like either you're going to be a history buff or you're going to be a true crime girly, right? And you're really not getting a lot of crossover between those two demographics of people. But I was like, what if you could create a show, an episode that told a story with historical significance, but in that true crime storytelling vehicle? That could be something really interesting and magical. And I think that's what I was going for. So, because I also feel like with a lot of these stories that are like kind of relegated to history, there's so much intrigue and like questions and stuff that people don't know that people would be interested in. So, for example, with the MLK episode, it's like, I asked a lot of people kind of in the research process for that episode, like, what do you know about Martin Luther King's assassination? And most people were like, I know basically nothing. Or there'd be like little things here and there, like, oh, wasn't he killed, on a balcony or something? Yes, he was killed on a balcony at a motel in Tennessee by a man named James Earl Ray, or so that's what James Earl Ray said, and then he was convicted of that crime and sent to life in prison. Turns out, though, that James Earl Ray has basically insisted that he's innocent after the fact, and Martin Luther King's family doesn't think he's guilty either. And in 1999, Coretta Scott King did a civil suit against the U.S. government and a bunch of other entities, basically saying that you were the ones who killed King, and they won that civil trial. And that's something that most people don't know. And they don't know the evidence of why they believe that to be true and why that jury decided the case in that way. And so those sorts of things are the things I thought would be really interesting in a true crime context. But then, of course, I also like to cover sort of like infamous true crime cases. You can think of one of the episodes we're going to do actually this season is a 2-part episode on the Manson family murders. That's a story that a lot of people might know, or maybe what is like, oh yeah, like maybe that was like a group of crazy hippies, right, that went on some kind of killing spree. But most people aren't aware of the fact that Charles Manson was trying to incite a race war, that he actually tried to pin multiple of his crimes on the Black Panthers. So I think just kind of trying to tell infamous cases from a new perspective, highlighting details you probably haven't heard. We did an episode on Jonestown in season 1. Most people have heard, like, don't drink the Kool-Aid, right? Or that this was maybe a mass suicide event, like with a cult, right? But a lot of people don't know that the majority of the folks who died in Jonestown were Black folks, primarily Black women, and that Jim Jones, the cult leader, was forwarding sort of a vision of racial and class equity, and that a lot of people felt like this group was actually a social justice organization. And a lot of the things Jim Jones said, if you listen to his tapes, are really compelling. I'm like, he kind of sounds a little like Bernie Sanders sometimes. So for me, I felt like there's these stories, there's like so many interesting details to these stories that people think they know, and that perspective needs to be heard. And then, of course, we're covering lots of cases that are maybe more typical true crime, and I'm just kind of adding things how I see it from my perspective, and then cases that really balance these questions of like culpability. I think true crime tends to fall into this idea of a really simple narrative of there's this innocent victim and this evil perpetrator, and it's like most of actual crime is more nuanced and complicated than that. Next week, or on this coming Monday, which this might be out actually at the time that this episode is released, but it'll be covering the story of Alice Sebold, who is a sort of like famous author who wrote the book The Lovely Bones, which was adapted into a movie that I really liked as a teen. It's a story about she was actually raped when she was in college, and the man who raped her was sent to trial and convicted of the crime. His name is Anthony Broadwater, except for turns out he didn't actually attack her. She wrongly identified him, which is a very common phenomenon, especially cross-racially. So that's an incident, or that's a case where the questions of culpability are really big. It's like, who's the victim here? Who's the perpetrator? It's complicated and it's hard because, Alice is definitely a victim. What happened to her was terrible. And also she made this mistake that really ruined somebody's life, right? So Anthony is also a victim. So all different kinds of cases. We have some wrongful convictions that are really important we're covering as well, but hopefully that kind of answers it.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. I think it's so interesting because there's so many true crime podcasts, right? And it's funny that you almost hear very similar cases in each of them, and they're not really adding anything new. It's just sort of the person telling the story has so much personality that like you could listen to 5 different versions of this story with different hosts and you're like, oh, I guess it's different, but it's really not. And you are adding a layer of research that goes beyond sort of what just pops up on the first page of Google, which I think is so important and very interesting. But also, again, ties in sort of the intersectionality of these cases. These aren't just like black and white issues of like crime, murder, financial fraud, sexual assault, whatever it is. It's so much more nuanced than that. There's race involved. There's equity involved. There's just so much else going on. And I think that's really an interesting angle to take in a true crime podcast. And even though it's not necessarily a social justice show, you as a person who's so passionate about those issues, it just comes out in the show. And I think that's really special and very cool. So tell me about this new season. And I've listened to the MLK episode, which I thought was very, very interesting and also incredibly timely, given the fact that obviously it was released on MLK Day, but also just the broader context of what's going on in the United States today. I'm curious your thoughts on that and like sort of would you do like a follow-up on this? And also like kind of what we can expect for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think definitely, releasing that episode on MLK Day was an idea from someone on our team at Tenderfoot, and I'm really glad that they had suggested it. Tenderfoot did another series called MLK Tapes that really dives into everything that I didn't get to cover in that single episode. And one of the things that I'd seen that Trump had announced that he was going to, at the time I first saw it, it was like he said he was going to, mandate the release of these files on the assassination. And so something I started to think about, like, what could be in them and what would we want to talk about. And I definitely think that, once those files are released, I'd love to do some kind of like follow-up or bonus to really see, does this add more to the story that we're already starting to tell? I think there are a lot of unanswered questions that I had at the end of writing that episode for True Crime. And so I definitely think, hopefully we can kind of circle back and close the loop on some of those things. Because I think, and definitely folks should go listen to that episode, but there's just so many potential suspects involved in this. And, with a conspiracy, we're talking about a group of people who are likely working in coordination together to ensure that MLK was assassinated. And I also think that it's likely that we might find other pieces of interesting information that aren't necessarily directly tied to his murder itself. For example, in the episode, we talk a lot about how COINTELPRO, which is a covert sort of like dirty tricks operation that was kicked off by the FBI to sort of infiltrate activist groups had targeted King, and like how they were literally like wiring his hotel rooms and stuff. Like they would like he would check into a hotel room and then they would like get the hotel room next door. And like that's wild to me. And a lot of that information has come out through some of the release of some of these pieces of evidence that have come out in the past. So I'm curious if there's going to be anything more like that in there as well. But it also looks like the files around JFK's assassination, I think one other, I don't know if you remember, are going to be coming out as well. So that'll be interesting too.
Yeah, I do. I know for sure it's JFK and MLK, but I'm not sure. It'll be interesting if, in my opinion, these are all weirdly interconnected. And so it's like, is there another thing that this sparks where people are like, oh, this is briefly mentioned in these files, but we don't have the file for that thing. And does this spark a release of a bunch of different things because so much context will be missing or tied to something else that seems really sketchy? And is this going to be sort of a domino effect of us sort of uncovering the government involvement in many things, not just these two?
I will add, though, I don't know. There could be interesting things in those files, and I'm certainly feel that they need to be released, and that, especially for the family's sake. But I also wonder how much is actually going to be actually in there, or that was like kept or retained, only because, with this episode on MLK that I did, I really kind of, one of the things I thought about a lot was like, what does it mean if a government who is like being accused of being implicated in this assassination is also the one investigating themselves? Like, yeah, they're going to be like, we had nothing to do with it. So it's like, if they did have something to do with it, are they really writing it down and then saving it? Like, maybe, but like, I don't know. So it does make you wonder, like, is it going to be the full story? Because you also have to imagine, like, Trump has got to know what's in those files. I assume he's been able to see them. I actually don't know. I'm not educated on this issue, but I assume he would have the security clearances to be able to view those before he made the decision to release them. So I don't know. Who knows what his grander plan or strategy might or might not be, but it does make you wonder, like, okay, maybe he feels like there's not anything that sensational in there, but I guess we'll see for ourselves.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And also, I've been going through my dad's case file, and it's, to your point, when the writing in a case file is very much from the perspective of the person writing it. So if they don't assume responsibility or they think something, their bias really comes out in the reporting in the case file. And so, yeah, it will be very interesting to see, the way that my dad's spoken about in his case file is it's very clear sort of what they thought of him. They don't see him as like, it's not a John Doe. We don't know what this person looks like, and we're just writing the facts about this case. It's very much like drug dealer, black man, et cetera, et cetera. So it'll be interesting to see sort of how they wrote everything as it was happening from their perspective, especially if they're not assuming responsibility. So it'll be really interesting just to see kind of what's going on. But yeah. And there's a level for me of just like mistrust, where if someone's doing something that seems quote unquote seemingly good, it's like, is there an ulterior motive here? What's the purpose of this? Why now? But we'll see.
I had read that he said that he was going to release them the first time. Maybe this is inaccurate, but I thought I read that in an article, but then chose not to. So yeah, you gotta believe that there's some plan here. I don't know what it would be, but yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a tactic. It feels like nothing is accidental. Like everything is strategic and on purpose. So it just feel like kind of what is the point of all of this? And I hope that we as a society don't get caught in sort of the game of it. I think, this TikTok ban has been very interesting, not to get totally off topic, but just watching how easily everyone sort of fell into the hands of it all and the sensationalism of it and everything that went down. I'm very cautious now to sort of give a lot of things weight, because now I'm like, are we just the pawns in this? Are we just doing the dirty work of everyone else by getting excited about something or whatever? So Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how it all transpires and when it will even come out. I mean, that, you sign something today. Do we get it, in a month? Do we get it in 3 years? Like, what's the timeline for this? And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. But you have other cases, obviously, that you're covering this season. Any other highlights? Any other cases you're really excited to share?
Yeah. Yeah. So I know I shared about a few of them, the MLK episode and the Manson like two-part series we're going to be doing. There's another case I'm excited for folks to hear that's coming out in February about a man named DeForest Johnson who is on death row right now for a crime that he says that he didn't commit. And I don't believe that he committed it either, which is a big thing to say because I've covered some wrongful convictions in the past. And like, I think even though, I think I have some personal leanings in those cases, I think this is a case where I feel very confident that he did not do what he's being accused of. The case also, like, against him that alleged by prosecutors is so egregious. But just to give people a little kind of sneak peek of what to expect, and you definitely look up to Forrest Johnson because his stakes are very like high, life and death stakes. So I'm not trying to gatekeep his story, but basically, kind of. He was accused of killing this sheriff who was working the night shift at this hotel behind the hotel. He was accused of killing him behind the hotel. But there's no physical evidence in the case at all. And in fact, all of, the police's pursuit of DeForest as a suspect came out of the statements of one individual, a teenage girl who changed her story many, many times. And that part's really interesting. And I go into an episode and was under quite a lot of pressure. So, and there's a lot of other crazy things just in, the case that they alleged against him and how the trial went down and all of that. So I think that folks will find that case interesting, but also just, I think it's just shocking what's allowable. I think, most people, if you're not necessarily either consuming a ton of true crime, or maybe you just are, don't have any connection to anyone who's kind of been through the criminal legal process, might not be aware that it's like, the things that are allowable are actually obscene. And so it's just shocking. It feels like it shouldn't be the case that you could convict someone and sentence them to the death penalty based in no physical evidence at all, and statements of one person whose story has changed a ton of times. But in fact, it happens, and quite a lot. Like, it's actually wild how many people are on death row who say that they are innocent and, are represented by the Innocence Project or other sort of like similar organizations. And, I think in January, what was it, like a bunch of people were all slated to be killed in 1 week and on death row. I think maybe it was like the single greatest week of executions that we had had in a long time. And it's so wild. The details of each of these cases are so unique and often very compelling. But that's a case I'm really excited about. And then there's another case too I'm excited about that's coming out towards the end of the season that is about Timothy Coggins, who was his murder was unsolved for 30 plus years and was just solved in the last few years. And I think just the reason that it took 30 years to solve it is really interesting because all that evidence was there all along. It just basically wasn't pursued. And I think there's a lot that people can take away from his case, and especially in the context, the social context we're living in now. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. So I'm excited about that. But just in general, I'm really looking forward to people's reactions to the whole series. Alongside the MLK episode, I also released that episode on Lauren McCluskey that I mentioned at the beginning, which is a very different episode than the MLK episode, because this is a modern case of a young girl from Utah who was, like I said, killed by an ex-boyfriend after she had done literally everything right and reported his behavior over and over and over and over again and was essentially ignored. And what I found really interesting about her story is that this is a young, beautiful white woman in college in Utah. This is the person that these systems are set up to protect. And yet they failed her. And I think that just proves that there's so much more that needs to be done and amended. But yeah, that's just a few highlights.
I love that. Yeah, no, I'm very excited. And I feel like every week it's just going to get better and better. And episodes come out every Monday.
Yep. So those
Okay.
two on the 20th and then every Monday after that for the next few months.
Amazing. And how many episodes are we getting?
So there'll be 10 episodes over the course of the season. So we have 8 more to go and then a few bonuses here and there, just to go with each of these episodes.
Amazing. That's so exciting. What is your process like to do that? I know you have sort of a team of people, but you have to do obviously so much research and a lot of work goes into this. And I know you've been working on this season for a while. So tell me a little bit about kind of like, I love obviously the making of the thing. So tell me a little bit about like how you, once you decide on a story, kind of then what?
Yeah. Yeah. So, really had to figure out a more streamlined process for season 2 because season 1 was completely independent and that was just me trying to figure out how do you even make a podcast. So really season 2 was about how can we make this in a little bit more of an efficient way. And so for me, it's like once we've selected an episode, the first thing I'm doing is kind of going and researching the sort of broad strokes, right? I'm going to like go to some primary sources and try to get a good idea of what this case is. And then at that point, I'm story arcing it. So I'm like, what is the most compelling way to tell this story to a true crime audience? And then from there, I am taking my outline and going and researching based on that arc, right? Because I think at first I was in a situation where I was just like, especially in an episodic series, it's like you're not using so much of the research you could do. You could do research for forever. And so this kind of helped me narrow in on like, okay, what are the things that we need to dive deeper into that are going to be really important to how I plan to tell the story. And then it's the writing process, which is like, that quote about like, it's, having written is like way better than having to actually write something. And so that part's hard, but it's always great when we can get through that because true crime is completed and it's, and a single episode is like 40 minutes of straight talking, 40 minutes to an hour. So I'm like, I've written a novel basically of between all these episodes. So yeah, we get through that. And then at that point, it's just, working with the team to kind of make sure that it sounds the best, finding the best music and scoring and all of that to bring it to life. And that was something that was more exciting for season 2 was having the opportunity to really like make it sonically like match how what it was in season 1, which is really just me, reading, and we had a little bit of music that played at certain moments of tension, and it was always the same music. And I always felt like, good music and sound design can really help emphasize those moments, of intensity. So yeah.
100%. No, it's so cool, I think, to watch independent shows sort of grow and elevate as the seasons, progress and adding in just those little things, I think is so exciting and so fun. And it sounds incredible. So definitely want people to listen just because it's from start to finish, from the research to the sound design to the quality of the show. It's just so good all the way through. But yeah, you're making like little documentaries. I mean, really, it's like so much. You're doing so much work for each case and each story and each episode. So it's really incredible. Yeah, of course. Is there anything else you want to share? Obviously, people who like my show are very interested in the lesser known cases, I would assume. Or they just like to hear me talk, which is insane. So that's probably not the case. But is there anything you want to share for people who maybe are interested in those types of stories that you want them to know about your show?
Yeah, I can guarantee that there are going to be multiple episodes that we'll be doing in this season that people will have never heard of, like cases people will never heard of. And so I think the majority of them people will have never heard of. And so I definitely think if that's something you're interested in, definitely True Crime is a show that you'll enjoy. And I think that really just there's something for everybody. So if, just try out the one that sort of appeals to you most based off the description. We do put a lot of time into writing those descriptions. So browse through and see. And then also, you could check out season 1 as well. We have, I think it's 13 episodes now that are in that season. So find that, see if there's something that appeals to you, and then see if you want to listen to more. But if you do listen and you like it, the biggest thing is really just to help with by, rating and reviewing and sharing with friends. I always feel like, everyone has that show on Netflix or whatever that they loved. And then they're like, okay, great. I'm done with the first season. I can't wait till there's more. And then there's no more, it's done. It's canceled. And so, that's the biggest thing that you can do to help a show is to actually like listen and engage with it. So I definitely hope that your listeners will check it out. And I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I love your show. And I know that everyone who listens will too. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode of Ice Cold Case. You can find Truer Crime wherever you get your podcasts. And I'll see you back here very soon for part 3 of Ice Cold Case.